This module will highlight the trade policies of developing countries, which are matters of considerable interest. After going through this lesson, you will be able to explain the need and importance for developing countries to formulate their trade policies. Describe free trade versus protection as policy options for developing countries. Analyze the various constraints they encounter in formulating policies. Highlight measures developing countries need for strengthening capacities to deal with emerging scenario under WTO regime. Suggest measures to facilitate trade of developing countries. It has been the objective of sustainable worldwide growth to enhance developing countries' participation and provide them benefits from fast emerging new global trade sectors. They should have access to development gains from international trade and the trading system. The governments have long been intervening in trade for a combination of political, economic, social and cultural reasons, and have options to intervene through a variety of instruments. For facilitating their trade and growth prospects, developing countries need to formulate suitable national policies at the macro and micro levels. These policies will address structural, institutional, technological and other related constraints. In this effort, they should have support from international policies to help improve their competitiveness and supply capacities. Formulation of trade policy for developing countries, the need and importance. According to UNCTAD, in the current economic environment of globalization, trade plays an increasingly important role in shaping economic and social performance and prospects of countries around the world, especially those of developing countries. No country has grown without trade. However, the contribution of trade to development depends a great deal on the context in which it works and the objectives it serves. In recent decades, a number of developing countries, most notably the East Asian newly industrializing countries, have been able to purposefully use the elemental force of trade to boost growth and development within a relatively short time span. While choosing their trade policy options, developing countries need to take into account the rationale behind various options. Developed countries, particularly the United States, are presently attempting to bypass the World Trade Organization by pushing two highly ambitious trans-regional trade pacts, the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. These two proposed trade agreements would include 2/3 of the world GDP and 1/3 of world imports. This will result in a fresh move towards global trade further into preferential direction. Besides, the growing interference of China and the US towards the WTO makes it difficult for developing countries to move forward and enhance their exports. This forces them to accessing the route of bilateralism permitted under the Article 24 of GATT 1994 and Article 5 of GATS. Trade negotiations have far-reaching implications for the range of choices which people can have by affecting their access to goods, services and opportunities. European Commission has emphasized 10 benefits of trade for developing countries. That is, it boosts development, enhances competitiveness, facilitates export diversification, encourages innovation, expands business opportunities for domestic companies, expands choices and lowers prices for consumers, plays a role in improvement of quality, labor and environmental standards, contributes to cutting government spending by expanding supply sources, strengthens ties between nations and creates employment opportunities. For developing countries, it is important to implement economic policies that, while increasing the competitiveness of their enterprises, also improve their reliability and efficiency. In the absence of business supporting national policies, developing countries would continue to have only a limited contribution to their development. Liberalization, unsupported by other complementary policies, may have negligible effects. Inappropriate macroeconomic policies can readily undermine the otherwise positive macroeconomic effects of trade policy. Investment policies are also crucial. Social protection systems are important to help smooth adjustments and address concerns that could lead to a backlash against reform. Larger regulatory environment must be supportive of private investment. Barriers to entry and exit at the firm level may break processes of resource allocation. Trade liberalization in an economy with many distortions can yield especially adverse outcomes and perhaps few benefits. Trade liberalization may be a necessary but not a sufficient condition for attaining more rapid growth. Part of the benefits of trade liberalization depends on other policies and institutions being supportive. While much remains to be done on the liberalization agenda, notably in trade in agriculture and services. Average rates of protection have come down dramatically around the world. The main policy challenges in developing countries have now become coping with regulatory and restrictive business practices that may impede taking full advantage of the trade. Now let us discuss about the policy options, free trade versus protection. The policy options comprise all the government's policies and decisions concerning the magnitude, composition, direction and nature of countries' international trade and investment. The main issue is how best to balance the effects of the policies needed to achieve the given objectives. International trade has been characterized as engine of growth for almost all developing economies. There exists positive externality for the domestic economy due to favorable relations between exports and economic growth as the developing countries' association with world market increases. This leads to reallocation of existing resources, benefits arising from economies of scale and specialization of labor in different directions of the economy. Developing countries and policy options. Foreign trade has played a very important role in India's economic growth. During the 1950s and 1960s, inward-looking import substitution strategy of industrialization was an important policy option. The external sector till 1990 was a small part of the Indian economy. As regards policy options, developing countries should either follow free trade or protection. Let us first be clear about the concepts of these two options, that is free trade versus protection. Free trade refers to the situation where imports are allowed to compete on equal terms with domestic goods without any intervention by the government to influence the choice of the purchasers or consumers. Domestic producers of goods may enjoy some natural advantages over imports because of transport cost, and this could be consistent with free trade situation. The point is that trade between countries is free. Trade is conducted unrestricted and uninterrupted by state intervention in any form. In this regard, the important assumption is that trade between countries is free, which means trade is unrestricted and uninterrupted by state intervention in any form. But the basic question is, does there exist free trade among countries? It is the general belief that free trade usually benefits developed countries more than the developing countries. In whatever way one looks at foreign trade, the internationalization of business and trade materializes worldwide prosperity. Despite that fact, no country allows international business to remain completely free. All countries impose some sort of barriers to restrict trade and business across national boundaries, though they vary in terms of the degree of control. Each country or trading bloc always establishes trade laws that favor their indigenous companies and discriminate against foreign ones. But there are reasons for trade barriers as well as for the efforts that have been made internationally to liberate trade. Jane Morrison has observed that free trade as a term is misleading. There has never been free trade in the sense of no barriers at all. Trade liberalization is therefore more accurate to indicate measures towards free trade. On the other hand, protection is generally given to domestic goods against imports of goods. It refers to the situation where imports are handicapped in their ability to compete with domestic goods. Such handicaps are imposed by the government of the country concerned. Thus, protection is an economic policy where governments intervene to restrain certain trade through the instrument of tariff and non-tariff regulations. It is often used to discourage imports of certain goods and protect domestic markets in various ways. Protectionism is often regarded as an obstacle to free trade because it subsidizes industries that could otherwise not compete fairly against others. Protection implies that it gives an advantage to the domestic producers in competing against imports in home market. Now coming to the case for free trade as a case against protection. Advocates of free trade argue that non-interference from the government will in normal circumstances lead to attainment of a just and equitable society. Companies increase not only their own returns but also the wealth of the wider society. Social considerations need not hamper business decisions of individual companies. The philosophy of free trade attempts to free economic activity from binding rules of the state. The idea is to allow competition to ensure the most efficient practices prevail, which should benefit everyone. It is argued that protection and trade restrictions may only benefit some sector of the country's economy, but will harm the consumers who may be denied access to foreign products. There is a possibility that this may distort overall pattern of domestic economic activity. It must be noted that it is always better to have some structural change in the economy through appropriate policy measures to solve basic problems confronting the economy, because protectionist measures were only palliatives and look to the symptoms. Thus, it is advisable to attend to the economic fundamentals as they are the sources of meager economic performance of the country. Now coming to the case against free trade as a case for protection. When countries find that their domestic economies are suffering because of a rapid growth of import penetration or import competition in the domestic market, they seek a solution by introducing a variety of restrictions on imports. In other words, governments set up barriers to free trade. The whole of these restrictions and barriers form an important part of a country's international trade policy or commercial policy, whose objective is to ensure that economic welfare of the country by influencing in various ways the level and direction of country's trade. Intervention by the government is regarded essential for ensuring that firms do not behave in irresponsible and socially damaging ways. Some prerogatives of companies must be surrendered for the common good. Free trade and the forces of globalization may lead to exploitation of natural resources and environmental damage. The question arises, why do countries resort to protectionist measures? There are a number of reasons, but the more important among these may be considered briefly. Developing countries need to switch from agriculture sector to the industrial sector, but for such diversification, they need to protect their industries. For developing new manufacturing industries, developing countries have to compete with the developed countries. However, in the beginning, such new industries may need protection in the form of tariff. This will not only protect them from foreign competition, but also enable industries to develop. After a few years, tariff may be reduced or withdrawn completely. Studies have shown that many developed countries of today have followed the path of tariff protection in the past. Franklin R. Root has very ably summarized the various arguments for protection, and the same is presented here. The first one is keep money at home. That is, to prevent national wealth from being transferred in exchange with another nation for goods. The second one is home market, to encourage home industry to continue. Then equalization of cost of production, that is to make local goods compare fairly against imports that might otherwise be cheaper because of technological advantages or other similar grounds. The fourth is due to low wage, to protect home industry against competition from imports from low wage countries. The fifth is prevention of damage, that is to safeguard against potential concessions that may have to be made in response to multinational trade agreements. The sixth is employment, that is to preserve level of home employment. Seventh is anti-dumping, to prevent dumping of the foreign products. The eighth, bargaining and retaliation, that is to seek reduction of tariffs by other countries or to retaliate against another country. The ninth is national security, to be on one's own for national security reasons such as war or natural calamities. The 10th is infant industry argument, that is to encourage new industry in the country. Then 11th is diversification, to promote a broad spectrum of industries in the country. The 12th one is the terms of trade and optimum tariff, that is to compensate the country for loss in revenue when price elasticity of import demand is greater than 0. The 13th is the theory of second best. Being the free trade is the best alternative, it cannot be pursued optimally because of a variety of distortions. As an alternative, new distortions of tariffs may be utilized to neutralize the existing distortions. Then finally, the 14th is balance of payment, that is achieving equilibrium in balance of payments. It is well to note that there can be non-economic reasons also for protection, such as political considerations, social objectives like public health and protection of environment. Some aspects of how protectionism in its new form is being used by developed countries include intervention in technology transfer, distorting market functions, providing vast subsidies to domestic industries, and at the same time expecting others to deregulate and become subject to market's force of supply and demand, and unilateral trade agreements. The advantages claimed for protection are given here. Number one, production and employment levels are not dependent on the whims of the market, which generally behave in a highly inconsistent manner. This behavior goes against national economic welfare and adversely affects economic growth, employment and dignity of labor. The second one is prevention of anti-social consequences and protection environment. The third one is management and avoidance of distortions in allocation of national resources. This may ensure social justice and fair living standards for all. The disadvantages of protection are as follows. Believing in the good sense of a small number of politicians, civil servants and bureaucrats for important policy decisions affecting the lives of millions of people. Then there is possibility of creating inefficiencies. It may distort the pattern of competition, which may provide unfair advantage to certain enterprises, industries and employees groups. It may danger of making the country internationally uncompetitive. The important point to note is that any error from the government side will harm large number of people who are likely to suffer following the implementation of not very well thought out policy. Now coming to various constraints they encounter in formulating policies. This section discusses the various problems that the developing countries face in international trade and their effect on agriculture, industry and service sector of the economy. In general, developing countries face a set of problems, particularly with developed countries. Some of these constraints pertain to the very structure of the developing countries themselves, and some of the problems are faced by them because of prevailing global trading environment. Some of these problems are external while others are internal. Internal problems relate to the lack of diversification of export basket, uncertain export market, and adverse terms of trade. Dominant external problems are competition in the global market, tariffs and non-tariff trade barriers, lack of quality standards, etc. Despite increasing integration to world market, policies of protectionism and trade barriers being pursued by developed countries create obstacles to developing nations' market access. In this regard, the point is that developed countries' protectionism in agriculture continues to be a major threat to developing countries as agricultural commodities from their major export. Many developed countries provide huge subsidies to support their farmers. By doing that, they discourage agricultural imports. Not only this, they sell their agricultural produce in world market at a lower price, which in turn decreases prices for agricultural commodities in the market and reduces export earnings for developing countries. A common misconception is that one has to be either pro-free trade or against free trade. However, important point is the conflict that affects the ideals of free trade approach or states protectionist approaches. Free trade as an ideology or theory has many valuable points that have attracted many scholars. The reality is that the new form of free trade pushed by the developed countries is being attacked by developing countries. It seems difficult to get the right balance between free trade and protectionism, especially between developed and developing countries. Successful policy options have always required a judicious blend of imported technologies with increasing promotion of domestic exports in globalized trading system. Scholars have criticized developed countries for trying to impose policies on developing nations which they had themselves rejected in their early industrialization. It is not enough for a developing country to be integrated into global value chains. It must be able to make a transition from imports through absorption, adaptation and diffusion. Technological innovation is crucial. Deepak Nayyar is of the view that India is yet to cross this transition to reach the goal. Ignoring decisions whether protectionism is equally bad or good for different countries at different levels of development is not the answer. Now coming to the measures developing countries need for strengthening capacities to deal with emerging scenario under WTO regime. Access to foreign developed markets is difficult because there are serious barriers to entry in certain sectors of particular interest to developing countries, including agriculture, textiles, clothing and fish products. Similarly, 10 developing countries received nearly 80% of the FDI going to the developing countries. Due to their typically smaller size and less diversified economic structure, many developing countries are more strongly affected and more vulnerable to changes in the international environment than the industrial countries. Trade policies and participation in the multilateral trading system of WTO requires an expansion of human resources and institutional infrastructure of least developed countries. The experience of different countries' reform efforts suggest that stable macroeconomic policies, structural reforms and outward-oriented trade and investment regimes go a long way to provide economic stability and thereby lower the risk premium attached to investment in least developed countries. Moreover, inadequate and inefficient road, rail, air transport facilities, storage facilities and telecommunications have also acted to limit the supply side response of least developed countries. At the institutional level, many such countries lack a transparent legal and regulatory framework, including company and bankruptcy laws and investment codes. In most least developed countries, the private sector is constrained not only by shortages of capital but also of entrepreneurial, managerial, technical and marketing skills. Effort to enhance export performance will require not only technical assistance aimed at strengthening the institutional infrastructure for trade and trade policy, but also initiatives aimed at enhancing the outward orientation of the private sector. Enterprise-oriented technical cooperation programs can underpin efforts to improve international marketing and business development. In reality, the many external and domestic factors that determine a country's export performance and more generally the pace of its integration into the global economy do not operate independently. There is a complex process of interaction with the rest of the world. Now let us discuss about the measures to facilitate trade of developing countries. According to Ellen Frank, being capital rich or capital poor is not a natural phenomena like having lots of oil. Capital is created typically with plenty of government assistance and protection. The US government protected its nascent industries with high tariff walls until they could compete with European manufacturers. After World War II, Japan effectively froze out foreign goods while building up world-class auto, computer and electronic industries. Korea later followed Japan's strategy. In recent years, so has China. Their infant industries are heavily protected by tariffs, quotas and other trade barriers. Foreign producers are welcome only if they establish high-tech facilities in which Chinese engineers and production workers can garner the most modern skills. Alice Amston and Danny Roderick have also concluded that carefully designed policies combined with protections for infant industries are most effective in promoting trade of developing countries. In this context, Anup Shah has observed that neither seems to answer the notion of fairness, though often these nations that promote free trade for all want protectionism for themselves. While free trade could be a possible way forward for fair trade, it can only be fair and free if large developed nations do not continue protectionist practices for some of their industries, while hypocritically requiring, sometimes forcing, developing nations to abandon such measures to the effect that it tips the trading balance unfairly in their favor. Such developing countries follow the path of bilateralism to push their exports, or should they stick to WTO's model of multilateralism? Various empirical studies have come to the conclusion that complying with the complex rules of origin to get preferential tariff treatment under bilateralism add to trade transaction cost. This results in low net realization from trade. As such, consensus-based multilateral trade regime under the WTO framework would work better for developing countries. However, the experience of working of WTO since its inception illustrates that multilateral trade liberalization moves slowly. The membership of WTO keeps on increasing. This was 161 on April 26, 2015, and it is difficult that all countries should come around agreement to a proposal. Hastening into bilateralism without creating a level playing field for domestic businesses will not help developing countries' exports. Thus, a desirable trade option for developing countries would be to have a suitable mix of bilateralism and multilateralism. Side by side, developing countries should upgrade their regulatory regime, particularly with respect to intellectual property, labor and environmental standards, to safeguard their long-term commercial interest. The present global challenge for trade is concerned with how to create practical ways to release the world economy's full potential for trade, investment and growth. The point is that crucial actions are needed to help developing countries in promoting their trade objectives. This include the necessary measures at the multilateral trading system, trade negotiations to improve market access and penetration, improvement in preferential schemes, flexibility and policy space, and financial support for debt relief and capacity building. Developing countries are expected to take measures at their end to improve their trade performance in the following way. Number one, they need to reduce their dependence on commodities and labor and resource intensive products. Number two, significantly enhance domestic export value added, and they need to improve growth performance and bring down levels of poverty. The UNCTAD has observed that the core challenge in moving up the value chain is the establishment of a virtuous circle among investment, innovation and technological change, productivity, supply capacity and enhanced export and growth performance. Now let us summarize what we have learned from this module. While the past century has seen a major shift towards free trade, many governments continue to intervene in trade. Governments have several key policy areas that can be used to create rules and regulations to control and manage trade. Government business trade relations are the relationships between national governments and global businesses. Governments intervene in trade to protect their nation's economy and industry, as well as promote and preserve their social, cultural, political and economic structures and philosophies. Governments are motivated by economic and political factors to intervene in trade. They may want to protect young industries or to preserve access to local consumers' markets for domestic firms. Cultural and social factors might also impact a government's intervention in trade. For example, some countries' governments have tried to limit the influence of American culture on local markets by limiting or denying the entry of American companies operating in media, food and music industries. Freeing of trade and liberalization of access to resources from regulation has many proponents. With centuries of mercantilist experience, developed countries aim at manufacturing and exporting, which makes developing countries dependent on them. Why do countries resort to protectionist measures? There are a number of reasons for that. That can be declining industries, employment protection, correct adverse balance of payments, prevention of dumping and assist the process of economic development, that is the infant industry argument. Even developed countries become more developed using measures to protect their industries with various forms of control. In matters of trade policy, political factors are always prevalent. Could regional free trade, whereby trade is amongst nations of similar levels of development, be an even better option in that context? These and many other options all need consideration by policymakers in developing countries. Policies to avoid the resurgence of protectionist measures should include multilateral cooperation at the level of WTO. However, the existence of gap between the developed and developing countries is important to note. The developing countries have to pay their imports and this affects their foreign exchange earnings, whereas the developed countries would not face adverse impact on their payments balances. The problem is that developing countries would have to find markets for their exports so as to pay for their imports.